I've seen it happen way too often. You spot a flashy laptop for a deal online, click through, and a few weeks later you're cursing the cheap screen, the choppy graphics, and the fact that you can't actually run the software you need for work. The regret feels almost immediate, especially when you realize you could have spent a little more and avoided the frustration. That's why I'm taking a closer look at the Dell Precision 5690, a workstation-class machine that's positioned as a smarter buy for people who need serious compute power without the usual laptop compromises. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the biggest hesitation most buyers have with a workstation laptop is whether the price is really justified. The Precision series isn't cheap, and the 5690 sits at the higher end of the market. What you're really paying for is a balance of CPU, GPU, and memory that can handle demanding C80, 3D rendering, or data science workloads. If you've ever tried to squeeze a 16-core Intel chip into a thin consumer notebook, you know the heat and throttling can be terrible. Dell's claim here is a Core Ultra 7165H with 16 cores and a base clock of 1.4 GHz, backed by 32GB of LPDDR5X memory. In real-world terms, that means you can keep multiple heavy applications open. Think Blender, Adobe Premiere, or MATLAB while the system stays relatively quiet because the LPDDR5X memory runs cooler than standard DDR4. For people who spend most of their day in a coffee shop or a small office, the 16-inch 19201200 IPS panel is one of the strongest selling points. The extra vertical space compared to a 1080p panel gives you more room for tool palettes or spreadsheet rows, and the IPS tech keeps colors accurate enough for light photo editing or video grading. I tested it by opening a 12-track audio project in Audacity while simultaneously running a 3D viewport in Unity. The display held steady at 60 Hz with no flicker, and the screen's brightness was sufficient even in a bright room, which is a nice surprise given the laptop's relatively thin chassis. Now, let's talk about the graphics side. The RTX A1000 with 6GB of dedicated VRAM is not a gaming card, but for workstation tasks it's a solid middle ground. In a recent benchmark I ran on a client's project, a 4K animation preview, that A1000 handled the scene without dropping frames, something a typical integrated GPU would have struggled with. However, if you plan to do heavy GPU-accelerated rendering or games at high settings, you'll notice the A1000 hitting its limits quicker than a full-blown RTX 3060. That's why I'd recommend the 5690 for professionals whose primary workload is CPU-intensive or who need modest GPU acceleration for design work, not for hardcore gamers. One hidden trade-off that becomes apparent after a few days of use is the storage capacity. The 512GB PCIe NVMe SSD is fast. Loads of software start up in under a second, and large files move quickly. But 512GB fills up fast when you're dealing with multi-gigabyte 3D textures, video footage, or large datasets. I quickly found myself moving older projects to an external drive to keep the internal SSD from hitting 80% usage, which can degrade performance over time. If your workflow involves regularly storing terabytes of video or raw design files, you should budget for an external SSD or consider a model with a larger internal drive. Battery life is another practical concern. Dell lists a modest 80 Wh battery, but under a real workday with the screen at 70% brightness and the CPU under moderate load, I saw roughly 4 to 5 hours of runtime. That's enough for a morning commute and a few hours of work, but you'll need to plug in for longer sessions. The upside is that the battery charges relatively quickly. A 30-minute charge gets you about 40% capacity, which can be a lifesaver in a pinch. Who should buy this machine? If you're a mechanical engineer, architect, data analyst, or video editor who needs a portable workstation that can keep up with multi-core software, the Precision 5690 hits the sweet spot. The combination of 32GB of LPDDR5X memory and a 16-core CPU means you can compile code, render frames, and run virtual machines without the usual lag. It also appeals to creative professionals who value color accuracy and a bit more screen real estate for their toolbars. Who should skip it? First, if you're a gamer looking for a high-end graphics experience, you'll be better off with a dedicated gaming laptop that sports a higher-tiered GPU and a higher refresh rate panel. Second, if your main workflow revolves around massive video files or huge datasets that exceed a terabyte, you'll either need to upgrade the internal storage or invest in a larger external solution, which adds cost and reduces portability. Lastly, if you're on a tight budget and can get away with a mid-range laptop for lighter tasks, the Precision's price premium may not be justified. Let's talk about the practical strengths and weaknesses I observed. Strengths: the display's extra vertical resolution, the quiet cooling system under sustained CPU loads, and the rapid SSD performance.